Humanity walked back into the Galactic Council 1,000 years after the galaxy declared them extinct. The last log entry. The recording was only 4 minutes and 17 seconds long. I had watched it 642 times. I know, because the playback system keeps count, and it stopped asking me if I wanted to reset the tally somewhere around year 2 of my posting on the reliquary. It just accepted, the way machines eventually do, that some humans need to watch the same 4 minutes and 17 seconds over and over again until the weight of it becomes something they can carry without bending. The image on the screen was not dramatic. That was the part that never stopped hitting me in the chest. There was no grand hall, no soaring speeches, no lighting designed to mark the moment as historic. It was a mid-session administrative proceeding of the Galactic Council, held on a Tuesday by their calendar, squeezed between a trade dispute involving the Velhari Outer Belt and a water rights argument among 3 species whose names most humans had never learned to pronounce correctly. The chamber was half empty. Several of the seated representatives were visibly distracted, checking messages, reviewing documents, doing the small work of bureaucracy that fills the gaps between the large things. One of the Norathi delegates appeared to be asleep. A clerk, small and gray-feathered, with the efficient and unhurried manner of someone who reads from lists every day, stood at the central podium and read from a list. Species, Homo sapiens. Common designation, human. Home system, Sol. Status, biologically concluded. Date of declaration, the 14th cycle of the 800th session. Motion carries. Next item. That was it. 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and most of that was the clerk waiting for the translation system to catch up before moving on to the water rights dispute. I am Admiral Archivist Sarah Mwangi Cole, and I am the keeper of the reliquary. The reliquary is what we call the hollowed asteroid at the edge of what used to be called the Kuiper Belt, before we stopped using Earth coordinates for anything except sentiment. It is a vault. It holds everything we chose to remember across 1,000 years of silence, the art, the music, the letters, the arguments, the terrible decisions and the brilliant ones, the ordinary days that turned out to matter more than anyone realized at the time. It holds the engineering schematics that kept 7th-generation ships running when nothing should have worked. It holds the medical logs, the voting records, the children's drawings, the oral histories recorded by people who knew they were the last thread of something and refused to let it snap. It holds the names of the dead. It holds this recording. I first watched it when I was 19 years old, sitting in a history seminar in the brown dwarf colony that my family had called home for 4 generations. Our teacher, a lean and serious man named Oliver Crane, who had the particular quality of someone who has spent his whole career trying to give people information that they are not fully ready to receive, did not prepare us. He just played it. Then he sat down and folded his hands and waited. Half the class did not understand why it mattered. They knew it was important, historically, because we had been told it was important since we were children. But knowing something is important and feeling why it matters are 2 entirely different things. The other half understood immediately, and those of us in that second group spent the rest of the day in a particular kind of silence that has no good name in any language I know. It is the silence you fall into when something you have been carrying at a comfortable distance suddenly becomes very close. What Oliver Crane said afterward was this: they did not hate you. That is what you must understand. They simply decided you were finished, and then they moved on to the water rights dispute. I have thought about that sentence almost every day of my adult life. Here is what the council did not know: on that Tuesday, in that half-empty chamber, when the gray-feathered clerk read our name from a list and moved on. The stellar event that destroyed Earth and the inner colonies was real. We are not disputing the loss. 140 million people died in the first 11 hours. Another 60 million over the weeks that followed, as the shockwave expanded and the infrastructure that kept people alive across the inner belt failed one by one. It was the worst thing that had ever happened to our species, and I will not soften it or minimize it or dress it in language that makes it easier to look at. It was catastrophic. It was the end of everything we had built and known and called home. But the outer colonies did not die. The 7th-generation ships that had already cleared the heliopause were beyond the reach of the event. The 2 deep void stations, built into the gravitational shadows of Jupiter's trailing Trojans, survived because they were never designed to be visible or prominent. They were research installations and emergency reserves, and their designers had been practical people who believed in redundancy and concealment in equal measure. And the brown dwarf colony, planted so far from the main transit lanes that most galactic charts did not even include it as a waypoint, was so remote that the shockwave arrived as little more than a ripple in the background radiation. We were alive. We went dark. This was not a unanimous decision. I want to be completely honest about that, because the story of the silence is not a clean story, and I am not interested in making it clean. It is a story about real people in impossible circumstances making choices that none of them were certain were right, and the truth of it matters more than the comfort of a simple narrative. The vote among the surviving human communities took 9 years and produced arguments that fractured families, ended friendships that had lasted decades, and drove 3 community leaders to resign in formal protest. Some people believed we should announce ourselves immediately. Some believed that the silence was cowardice dressed up as strategy. Some believed it was the only form of wisdom available to us in that moment. The ones who argued for silence made a single point. They made it quietly, without anger, without drama, sitting across tables from people who disagreed with them and looking them in the eyes. They said, "Look at the recording." They declared us extinct in 4 minutes. On a Tuesday. Between 2 other items on a list. If we announce ourselves now, broken and small and scattered and desperate, what do we imagine happens? What kind of help do we think is coming from a galaxy that has already done the paperwork on our deaths? Do we want to spend our remaining energy begging for recognition, or do we want to spend it building something that does not need to beg? The vote was close. Closer than most people in the silence era wanted to admit, and closer than any official history has ever been fully willing to record. We went dark. And in the dark, for 1,000 years, we built. I am writing this in the reliquary, in year 3 of what we are calling the return. The fleet is already moving. Ambassador Dara Sundaram Petrov is 2 weeks from Council space. Earlier this morning, the Council's annual memorial beacon went out, as it does every year at this time, listing all species officially declared extinct in the last millennium, sending a small formal light into the dark for each one. Humanity is on the list, near the bottom, in alphabetical order by common designation. They lit a small light for us. Somewhere in that chamber, a clerk read our name from a list. I watched the broadcast from my desk at the reliquary, with my second cup of coffee cooling beside me and 17 million archive items queued for cataloging. I had to pause it twice, not from grief, exactly, but from something I do not have a precise word for. A kind of pressure behind the eyes. A fullness in the chest that is too complicated to name. Then I went back to work. The reliquary has 17 million items to catalog and organize before the return fleet reaches the Council chamber. I intend to have them ready, organized, accessible, and presented in a way that tells the full story without apology or embellishment. When the galaxy decides to look at us again, really look, I want everything laid out in perfect order. I want them to see exactly what 4 minutes and 17 seconds on a Tuesday morning produced. I pressed play again. The gray-feathered clerk stood at the podium. Species, Homo sapiens. Status, biologically concluded. Outside my porthole, the star we named Endurance during the silence was burning the same as always, indifferent and steady, keeping light for anyone who needed it. I watched the recording to the end. I have watched it 642 times. I smiled. It was, I think, the first time I had ever smiled while watching it. What we did in the dark. I am engineer historian Tomas Reyes Okafor, and I was not supposed to be the one writing this. The original assignment went to Professor Celia Hartwood, who has more academic credentials than I have had years of sleep, and who has been studying the silence era with the particular intensity of someone who considers it a personal mission rather than a professional one. She declined the commission 6 weeks ago, very politely, in a handwritten letter that I have since read so many times I have memorized it. It contained the most honest sentence I have ever found in an official document. It said, "I do not think I am the right person for this, because I still get angry when I try to write it, and this record should not be angry. It should just be true. I am also angry. But I promised Dara that I would try to be true first, and angry second, and only when the truth requires it." This is the record of the silence. 1,000 years of human history that the galaxy does not know happened. I am compiling it from logs, letters, oral testimonies, engineering schematics, medical records, voting tallies, crop yield reports, community meeting minutes, children's drawings, poetry written in recycled margins, songs recorded on equipment that barely worked, and in one remarkable and deeply human case from the 400th year, A 6-hour audio recording of a community meeting aboard Ship 7 in which 43 adults argued at full volume about whether to name a newly discovered moon after a pre-catastrophe football club. They named it after the football club. The vote was not close. I find this deeply comforting, and I have included the full recording in the archive because I think future generations should understand that the people who kept the human species alive were not austere visionaries every day of their lives. Some days they were just people who cared very much about football, and that is also part of what we are. I am going to give you the truth of what happened, not the version that makes us look like heroes from the first sentence. Because the first years were not heroic. They were just terrible, and the people who lived through them were ordinary people trying very hard not to stop existing, and they deserve to have that told plainly. In the first generation, roughly the period between year 1 and year 200, the primary cause of death among the human survivor population was not the ongoing effects of the stellar catastrophe. It was a respiratory illness that developed in the recycled air systems of the generation ships sometime in year 4, spreading silently through ventilation networks that had been designed to keep people alive but had never been designed to manage an infection of this particular type. We lost 9,000 people in 8 months. 9,000. On ships that had started with a combined population of just over 300,000. Every death was noticed. Every death had a name and a family and a bunk that stayed empty afterward. A doctor named Petra Novak, working in a converted cargo bay on Ship 3 with equipment that would have been considered inadequate even by the standards of pre-catastrophe emergency medicine, developed the treatment protocol that stopped it. She worked without meaningful sleep for 11 consecutive days, using the ship's barely functional analysis systems and her own training and the desperate creativity of someone who knows that failure is not an acceptable outcome. When it was over, she wrote a brief and characteristically unsentimental report, filed it in the medical log, and went back to her bunk and slept for 36 hours. When she woke up, she ate whatever was available in the common kitchen that morning, and went back to work. I include this because Petra Novak has no monument. There is no station named for her, no annual memorial, no famous portrait in any of our community halls. She is entry 472 in the Ship 3 medical records, year 4, and if you were not specifically looking for her you might scroll past without pausing. She saved 9,000 lives and then kept going. There were thousands of Petra Novaks in the silence era. Thousands of people who did the necessary extraordinary thing and then got up the next day and did the next thing. I want the record to hold at least some of their names, because a civilization is not just its grand decisions. It is these moments, quietly performed, with no audience. Year 14, the brown dwarf colony ran out of protein supplement base. The calculation was simple and brutal. At current consumption rates, the colony would begin experiencing serious nutritional deficiency within 18 months, and there was no resupply coming and no alternative source available in the systems they were permitted to access without risking detection. The problem was handed to every available engineer and biologist simultaneously, and the solution, developed over 3 weeks by a 16-year-old girl named Grace Adeyemi who had been formally assigned to water filtration and unofficially assigned to whatever needed doing, involved repurposing the colony's water filtration microbes into a nutritional substrate through a process that Grace later described as mostly guessing and being too young to know what was supposed to be impossible. The resulting food product tasted, by all accounts and across multiple decades of subsequent testimony, like unseasoned paste. It was also exactly sufficient to keep everyone alive. Grace Adeyemi later led the colony's atmospheric engineering division for 40 years, producing work that has since been assessed as among the most significant contributions to closed-system life support in any known civilization. When she retired, she said the best decision she ever made in her entire career was accepting that paste was good enough, because good enough meant everyone lived long enough to eventually do better. I think about Grace Adeyemi whenever I am tempted to wait for a perfect solution before attempting any solution at all. Year 67, the first child born in the brown dwarf colony who had absolutely no memory of Earth whatsoever stood up in front of her class during an oral presentation and was asked, as a standard exercise, to describe home. She described the colony. She described the corridors and the growing bays and the particular light quality of the artificial dawn cycle and the smell of the atmospheric processors and the sound the pressurized doors made when they opened, which she loved because it was the first sound she heard every morning. Her teacher wept. Her teacher had been born on Earth and had walked outside under a real sky and felt rain. For the child, who was 7 years old and curious and kind, the weeping was confusing. She came home that afternoon and asked her grandmother what Earth had looked like. Her grandmother described the sky. The real sky. A yellow sun, not simulated, not filtered, not delivered through a dome. And clouds, the real ones, the enormous slow-moving ones and the fast thin ones and the dark ones that meant rain. And the particular blue that Earth's sky made at the hour before sunset, which does not exist anywhere else in the confirmed universe, which no camera has ever fully captured because there is something about standing under it that the image cannot contain. The child listened very carefully with the focused attention of a 7-year-old who understands she is receiving something important. Then she said, "That sounds beautiful. I would like to see it one day." Her grandmother said, "Yes." She did not say, "You will." She did not say, "Maybe someday." She did not say anything else. She just said yes, and held the child's hand, and that small word carried everything that could not be said. Year 131, the incident aboard Ship 7. I am going to tell this plainly, because it is part of the record and the record must be honest even when honesty is uncomfortable. A faction within Ship 7's population, roughly 300 people out of a total population of 11,200, formed with the intention of seizing control of the navigation communications system and broadcasting a location signal to request assistance from the galactic community. Their reasons were not unreasonable. They were exhausted and frightened, and many of them had children, and they could not stop thinking about what it meant to raise those children in permanent hiding, never knowing if the silence was protection or just a different kind of ending. They wanted help. They believed help was available. They believed the silence was a choice made by a handful of people that was being imposed on everyone, and they were not willing to keep accepting it. The attempt failed. Not through any act of force. Through the quiet, organized, absolutely committed resistance of the remaining 10,900 passengers, who, when word spread through the ship in the middle of a sleeping cycle, got up in the dark and organized themselves into rotating shifts and physically blocked every access point to the navigation and communications deck, holding those positions around the clock for 11 days. They brought food to each other in the corridors. They took turns sleeping in shifts of 2 hours. They did not shout or argue. They simply stood there. At the end of 11 days, the matter was brought to a formal vote of the full ship population. The vote was 81% in favor of maintaining silence. The 300 people who had organized the attempt were not expelled, not sanctioned, not stripped of any standing or privilege. They were given a formal hearing in which every one of them was permitted to speak for as long as they needed, and they were listened to, and their concerns were acknowledged as genuine, and their courage in acting on their convictions was formally noted in the record. And then they were asked to please come and have something to eat, because the common kitchen had made something that was slightly better than the usual paste, and there was enough for everyone. Several of those 300 people became, in the following decades, among the silence era's most committed and productive engineers and community leaders. As if the act of losing the argument had settled something in them that needed settling, freed them to put their considerable energy toward the thing they had ultimately stayed for. Year 203, the Quiet Mandate. This was the governing compact that formally bound all surviving human communities to a single shared framework for the first time since the catastrophe. It was reached by representatives who had never met in person, communicating through a tight beam relay system so narrowband and precisely aimed that detecting it from outside would have required knowing exactly where to look and why. The representatives argued for 8 months. The mandate they produced had 3 articles. 1. No open transmission. Ever. Under any circumstance. The silence is total and non-negotiable. 2. Every available resource, technical, intellectual, material, and human, is directed toward making the human population capable of indefinite self-sufficiency across any condition the universe might produce. 3. The question of whether to end the silence is reviewed by popular vote, once per generation, at regular intervals. Not more often. It was the second article that changed everything. Not immediately. Immediately it was just words, like most second articles of most governing compacts. But over time, as the words became policy and policy became culture, the effect was profound. When you tell an entire civilization that survival and capability are the only measure of success, something shifts in the way people think about what is worth doing. A materials engineer in the void stations, a man named Clive Ostrowski, who had trained as a musician and ended up in engineering because the ships needed engineers more urgently than they needed musicians, spent 14 years developing a hull composite that could identify and repair microfractures using only the ship's own thermal gradient. No external materials, no specialist team. He did it in his private hours, after his official shifts ended, on equipment he had to requisition and justify to 3 different oversight committees. When it worked, he wrote up the design in a single night, filed it with the technical commons the next morning, and then went to work on the next problem. He said, in an oral history recorded in year 222, "I just figured it out because we needed it figured out." That is not heroism. That is Tuesday. By year 400, human communities had developed 14 distinct technologies that were, as best as we can now assess from galactic records, completely unknown to the wider civilized galaxy. By year 600, that number was 342. Not because the humans of the Silence era were inherently more intelligent than the species of the Galactic Council, and not because they had access to better resources. They had worse resources, by almost every objective measure. They did it because they had no one to buy solutions from. They had no established industry to ship in the answer. They had only the problem, and the stubborn refusal to let the problem be the final word. Year 712, the first generation born into what historians now call the flourishing period. This was the era, roughly 200 years in length, when the human communities had moved beyond primary survival mode and were building in the fuller sense of the word. Culture and infrastructure and trade between communities through the encrypted relay network. Art made not because survival required it but because people needed it the way they need air. Music composed by people who had never seen Earth but had been told about it their whole lives. A renaissance made entirely of inherited memory and forward momentum. A composer named Alicia Ford, working in the brown dwarf colony in year 745, wrote a symphony based on recorded descriptions of a rainstorm, because she had never seen rain and never would unless the silence ended. She worked from everything available, the oral histories, the old recordings, meteorological data from pre-catastrophe archives, the testimonies of the very elderly people in the colony who remembered what it felt like to stand outside with water falling from an actual sky. She wrote for 2 years. The symphony lasts 1 hour and 4 minutes. In the Silence era, it spread through every human community through the relay network, copied and recopied and listened to in corridors and growing bays and tiny private quarters by people who also had never seen rain. I have listened to it many times. I have cried every single time. It is, in my personal and entirely subjective opinion, among the finest pieces of music any human being has ever produced, and it was written by someone who only knew what it was trying to describe through the words of people who missed it. Year 900, the generation vote. The one that mattered most, because by year 900 the human population had reached 14 billion people across 11 systems, and the silence that had protected a desperate handful of survivors was now the defining condition of an entire civilization that had grown far beyond desperation. 14 billion people, most of whom had never experienced anything but the silence, and the question of whether to end it was no longer theoretical. I voted yes. I want to be clear about that, because this is my record and I believe in honesty about where I stood. The margin was 51.3% in favor. I have spent 3 years since then turning that number over in my mind. Out of 14 billion people, the difference between going back and staying hidden was a margin of just over 1 in 20. 700 million people voted the other way. 700 million people looked at everything we had built in the dark and said, "This is worth protecting. This is worth staying for. Do not risk it." I understand them. Sitting here now, I understand them more than I did on the day I cast my vote. What we built in the silence is extraordinary and strange and entirely ours, shaped by 1,000 years of necessity and invention and grief and stubbornness, and none of it exists anywhere else in the known galaxy. There was a real argument, and I do not dismiss it, for keeping it exactly as it was. The people who voted yes said, "We did not survive for 1,000 years in order to stay in the dark. We survived in order to come back. We are not the same species that left, and the galaxy is not the same galaxy that signed the paperwork, and that meeting, between two things that have both changed in ways neither expected, is worth having." The memorial stones are real, and I want to be precise about what they are. In every human settlement, there is a carved or printed record of the species that signed the Extinction Declaration. It lists their names. That is all it does. It does not include any language about guilt or blame or what should be done. It is not a list of enemies. It is not a threat. It is exactly what we say it is, a reminder. We built it so that the people born into the flourishing, who had never experienced what it cost to get there, would not forget that it cost something. That someone signed a piece of paper. That someone decided we were finished. We decided differently. The fleet leaves in the morning. I will not be on it, because the archive needs a keeper, and I volunteered before the question was asked. But Tomas will be there, and Dara will be there, and 14 billion people will be watching through the relay, and when I sit at my desk in the reliquary and look at the star called Endurance through my porthole, I will know, for the first time in the 3 years since I started this job, that the archive I have been keeping is no longer just a record of the past. It is a record of what we brought back with us. First contact, again. The Velhari patrol captain's name, according to our translation protocols, rendered approximately as Captain Harrow, which our systems flagged as a reasonable phonetic approximation and which I accepted without ceremony because in that moment I had more important things to think about than the precise rendering of consonants. Harrow took 11 seconds to respond to our hail. I know this because I counted. I am a person who counts things when I am nervous, because counting gives the mind something to do that is not imagining everything that could go wrong. 11 seconds is not long, in the ordinary management of a day. In the context of standing at the transmission array of a human flagship in Velhari patrol space, speaking words that no human had transmitted openly in 1,000 years, 11 seconds is an extremely long time. I am Ambassador Dara Sundaram Petrov of the Human Union, and the consequence is my ship, and I have never, not once in my career or my life, felt the way I felt in those 11 seconds. The closest word I have for it is the feeling of stepping off the edge of something very high, in the breath before you discover whether you are going to fall or fly. The consequence is an Explorer-class vessel, which is a designation that sounds more impressive than the reality, though the reality is itself impressive if you know what to look at. She was designed over the course of 40 years by 3 successive generations of engineers in the Brown Dwarf colony, none of whom had ever seen another species ship in person. They worked from galactic technical records gathered carefully and quietly over decades through channels that were legally gray at best. They built something that was recognizably derived from that broader tradition while being distinctly, unmistakably human, cleaner lines, different proportional logic, engines that ran hotter and quieter than the standard designs because the engineers who built them had been solving heat management problems in closed systems for centuries and had developed approaches that the broader galaxy had never needed to think about. She was named by her chief architect, a quiet and precise woman named Helen Park, who said only that she believed names should mean something. The consequence had 2 sister ships in the formation. The Relay, which carried our communications infrastructure, and the Record, which carried Tomas and the archive team and a compressed copy of the entire silent era human historical record in 47 different formats, because we had agreed, in the planning sessions that preceded the return by 3 years, that when we walked back and we were going to be prepared to prove everything we said. Harrow's voice came through layered with translation overtones. Identify your vessel and species affiliation. I said, this is Ambassador Dara Sundaram Petrov of the Human Union, aboard the Explorer-class vessel Consequence. We are requesting permission for passage through Velhari patrol space, en route to the Galactic Council chamber. 4 seconds. Then, please repeat species affiliation. I said, human. Homo sapiens. Sol system in origin, with additional recognized systems in the outer reach and deep void. We have been informed that our species is currently listed in the Council's memorial registry as biologically concluded. We are here to discuss the accuracy of that listing. What followed was not a communication delay. The Velhari outer belt was close enough that our signal reached Harrow in under a second in each direction. The 11 seconds of silence that followed my second transmission was not technical. It was human, in the most universal sense of that word. It was the sound of a mind encountering something for which it had no prepared response and needing a moment to catch up. Then Harrow said, very quietly, this is not possible. I said, I understand why it seems that way. We would very much like the opportunity to explain. Our weapons systems are fully offline. Our shields are at minimal passive setting. We have 3 vessels in this formation, and all 3 are broadcasting complete system telemetry on open frequencies so that your sensors can independently verify our configuration and capabilities. We are not approaching in any manner designed to cause alarm. Harrow said, please hold your current position. I need to make a report. I almost smiled. 1,000 years of silence, 3 years of planning, and the response to the impossible was I need to make a report. There is something deeply, recognizably ordinary about that response, and it told me something useful about the Velhari, that when faced with something genuinely unprecedented, they did what any sensible being does. They called someone more senior and described the situation carefully and waited for instructions. We held position for 40 minutes. During that time, my second officer, a 26-year-old man named Owen Briggs who had grown up on the void stations and had the particular quality of someone raised in engineered silence, meaning someone who had learned very young to be calm in environments where everyone being calm was a collective survival strategy, brought me a cup of tea without saying anything. He just set it on the console and went back to his station. I drank it. We had been growing the plants for 2 generations, and the tea was excellent. When Harrow came back on the channel, he had authorization. He cleared us for passage through a specified corridor, transmitted the coordinates, and informed us that an escort would accompany us to the edge of Velhari space. I said, "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your patience and your cooperation." He said, "Ambassador. With your permission. One question." I said, "Of course." He said, "How? How is this possible?" I said, "We did not stop." A pause. Then, "I see." He said it in the tone of someone who does not yet see at all, but who has the professional discipline to acknowledge a response and move forward. I found it entirely reasonable. I would not have understood it either, 11 days ago, if I had been in his position. But I had lived it, and Tomas had spent 3 years turning it into a record, and we had 17 million items in an archive that answered exactly that question in more detail than any one being could absorb in a single conversation. The escort was 2 Velhari frigates, gray and elegant, flying in loose formation on our flanks about 3 kilometers out. They did not hail us again. They did not need to. Their presence communicated everything that needed communicating. "We know you are here. We are watching. Nothing has been decided yet." The 11 days to Council space were the strangest days I have spent in a life that has had some genuinely unusual days. We moved at standard approach velocity, which was our deliberate choice. We could have traveled faster. Our engines run hotter than standard designs, and our transit time at full capacity would have been roughly half what we were taking. We chose the slower speed for the same reason we had chosen 3 ships instead of 30, and the same reason I had transmitted on a polite hail frequency instead of a priority emergency channel. Everything we did in those 11 days was a message, and the message was, we are not rushing. We are not desperate. We have time, because we are not going anywhere. Every vessel we passed asked some version of the same question. Some asked it directly. A Norathi merchant hauler hailed us 3 times before I agreed to take the call, at which point their captain, a large and expressive individual who communicated a great deal through the movement of their forearms, stared at me for a full 7 seconds and then said, "Are you genuinely a human? Like, an actual human?" I said, "I am." She said, "Where did you come from?" I said, "Primarily from the brown dwarf system in the outer reach. You will find it on your charts as a gravity anomaly in grid 77 alpha if you look carefully. We have been there for some time." She said, "How long is some time?" I said, "Approximately 1,000 years." She considered this for a moment. Her arms moved in a pattern that our translation overlay flagged as a gesture of profound and sincere surprise with no negative connotation. She said, "Huh." That was the most honest response we received from anyone in 11 days, and I mean that as a genuine compliment. The harder conversations came from the 6 species that had signed the original Extinction Declaration, 3 of which hailed us formally and requested to speak with the mission commander during our transit. I took every one of those calls personally. I did not delegate them to staff, not because my staff was not capable, but because I wanted those species to see a human face, to understand that we were not abstractions or representatives of a concept. I am a person. I was born in the brown dwarf colony to parents who were born there, and their parents before them, and I am here because 9 generations of ordinary people made choices in the dark that I will never be able to fully repay. The most difficult of those 3 conversations was with a senior administrator from the Laura T. Assembly, an individual of considerable age and obvious distress, who spent the first minutes of our conversation explaining, with genuine and evident pain, that the declaration had been made in complete good faith based on the evidence that was available at the time, and that no one had intended any harm, and that the Laura T. Assembly had held a formal memorial for the human species in year 600 and had considered it one of the significant moments of regret in their diplomatic history. I said, "I believe you. I believe the intention was not harmful." They said, "We genuinely thought." I said, I know. I believe that too. They said, I do not know what to say to you. I said, you do not need to have the right words yet. We have time now. That is the thing we have now that we did not have before. We have time, and we intend to use it carefully, and I would be very glad if your people were willing to use it with us. The relief on their face was almost too large to witness. They had been carrying something for 950 years without knowing they were carrying it, because guilt without an object has no weight and no shape and you cannot put it down. But we were here now, and the weight had somewhere to go, and I watched it go, and I felt something complicated about that which I am still working through. We did not enter council space until the morning of the 11th day by the council's calendar. The approach took us through the outer orbital ring, past 1,000 years of accumulated civic infrastructure, stations and relay beacons and traffic management platforms and the 1,000 ordinary pieces of a galactic civilization doing its daily work. I stood at the forward observation deck of the Consequence for the last 2 hours of the approach, watching it all come into view, and I thought about a 17-year-old girl named Grace Adiemi who had saved a colony with paste, and a doctor who had worked 11 days without sleep, and 43 people arguing about a football club. I thought about Alicia Ford, who had never seen rain and had written the most beautiful music I know. I thought about the 140 million dead. I carried all of them the way you carry a stone in your pocket. You feel it with every step. After a long enough time, you stop noticing the weight and start noticing only that it is there. The Consequence docked at 7 Alpha exactly on schedule. Council traffic control had been professional and unhurried and had given us no difficulty whatsoever, which was itself a data point. Someone had made a decision about how to handle our arrival, and that decision was, normal protocol, no special treatment in either direction, let the procedure speak. I stepped off the ship onto council ground. I took one breath of recycled station air that smelled nothing like the brown dwarf colony and everything like the particular moment when something you have been building your whole life becomes something that is actually happening. Owen Briggs was behind me. He said, very quietly, ready. I said, we were ready 1,000 years ago. I walked toward the chamber. The session. The chamber of the Galactic Council is designed to be the most impressive room in the known galaxy, and whoever designed it understood their job completely. The ceiling ascends to a height that makes the upper galleries permanently shadowed, visible as a dim suggestion of space rather than a defined boundary. The floor is vast and circular, with the speaking position at the center and the delegations arranged in concentric tiers that rise on all sides, so that whoever stands to speak is simultaneously elevated and surrounded, at the center of attention in every direction. The acoustics are a technical achievement in themselves, engineered so that every voice carries to every seat without any amplification system, which means that a quiet word at the podium sounds, to the person seated in the highest and most distant gallery, like someone speaking very calmly right next to them. The floor is inlaid with the seals of every species that has ever held a council seat, rendered in materials that have been maintained and polished for centuries. I noticed, as I walked to the petitioning position, that our seal was in the third row from the entrance. The historical records show that it used to be closer to the center. At some point in the last 1,000 years it had been moved to the outer ring, the way you rearrange the furniture of a room after someone leaves and you do not expect them to return. I stood on it for a moment before moving to my position. There were 914 individuals in the chamber for the session. I had read the manifest 3 times during the docking period, and the composition of the audience told its own story. 11 council species had sent full delegations. 23 had sent their senior representatives. The Velhari had sent First Voice Karen, their foreign affairs minister, which under standard Velhari diplomatic protocol is a designation reserved for first contact scenarios. The Thasari, whose territory neighbors the area where our brown dwarf colony sits, had sent all 5 of their current council members and filed a formal request to speak. The session was opened by Administrator Veloris of the Orati, an individual of considerable age whose face held the particular stillness of someone who has sat in this chamber for decades and has learned to process whatever the chamber produces without visible alarm. Veloris said, "The Council convenes this extraordinary session at the request of the entity designating itself as the Human Union. The record will note that this designation corresponds to a species currently classified in Council archives as biologically concluded. The Council will hear the petitioner's opening statement before proceeding to consideration of procedure and standing." I stepped to the speaking position. I said, "Administrator Veloris. Members of the Council. I am Ambassador Dara Sundaram Petrov, representing the Human Union. I represent 14 billion human beings, living and working across 11 systems in the outer reach and deep void, in communities that have existed continuously for 1,000 years. I am here because your records contain a factual error, and we would like the error corrected. The chamber was silent in the specific way that a room full of beings who are very practiced at controlling their responses falls silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence of 914 individuals simultaneously deciding how to hold what they are hearing. I continued, the declaration of human extinction, entered into Council record during the 800th session, was based on the assumption that the stellar event in the Sol system had eliminated all human life. That assumption was incorrect. The surviving human population, comprising the crew and passengers of 7 generation ships, 2 deep void stations, and 1 outer reach colony, went into total communication silence immediately following the event. The reasons for that decision are fully documented and available for review. The outcome is standing in front of you. We are not extinct. We were never extinct. The declaration was made on the basis of an incorrect assumption, and we are formally requesting that it be withdrawn and corrected. From the Velhari delegation, First Voice Karen raised an objection marker. Veloris acknowledged it. Karen said, the Council cannot adjudicate claims advanced by an entity that does not currently hold recognized standing. The petitioner has no procedural basis to request Council action. I had been expecting this from Karen specifically, because I had studied Karen's public record and understood that they were methodical and process-oriented and would reach for procedural grounds before any other type of objection, because procedure was the cleanest way to close a door without appearing hostile. I said, the petitioner is not requesting Council action requiring standing. The petitioner is presenting a factual correction to the Council record under Article 7 of the original Charter, which provides that any declaration made without physical confirmation of the declared condition is subject to review upon presentation of contradicting evidence. The contradicting evidence is myself. I am here. I am a human being. I am the physical confirmation that the declaration was made in error. A pause moved through the chamber. Veloris said, the administrator will require a recess to consult the relevant charter language. I said, of course. The recess was 43 minutes. I stood at the speaking position and did not sit. This was not stubbornness. It was a deliberate choice made during planning, because sitting down would have read as comfortable, and comfortable was not the signal. The signal was, I can stand here as long as necessary. I have been standing here, in one sense, for 1,000 years. When Veloris returned, their expression had shifted precisely as much as a very controlled face shifts when the legal answer is not the administratively convenient one. Veloris said, the administrator finds that Article 7 does apply in principle to the circumstances described. The Council will hear the full petition. Karen immediately registered a second objection. Veloris acknowledged it, and Karen stood and spoke for 11 minutes in a precise and organized manner. The argument was that regardless of the Article 7 question, the reinstatement of a species that had been absent from galactic civilization for a millennium required a comprehensive security review, a full capability assessment, and a vote by the complete Council membership conducted under standard reinstatement protocols, none of which could be completed in a session. It was a legitimate procedural argument. Karen was not fabricating obstacles. They were using the actual machinery of Council process, which is designed to be slow and thorough for exactly these kinds of situations, as a mechanism for delay. They were also, I noted, not disputing the factual claim. They had not stood up and said, we do not believe you are human. They had stood up and said, the process required for reinstatement is lengthy. Which was an implicit acknowledgement that the question was not whether we were human, but what to do about it. When Veloris gave me the opportunity to respond, I said, First Voice Karen is correct that full reinstatement requires a comprehensive process, and the Human Union is not requesting that process be abbreviated or waived. We accept the requirement for security review, capability assessment, and a full Council vote conducted under standard protocols. We welcome all of it. What we are asking for today is narrow, only that the factual error in the existing record be acknowledged and corrected. The Human Union cannot enter any process as an extinct species, because we are not extinct. Every subsequent step of the process you have described can and should proceed on accurate foundations. You cannot build a fair evaluation on a false premise. The premise is false. We are asking you to correct it. From the Thesari delegation, Senior Delegate Miran, whose territory was the closest to our known systems and who therefore had the most immediate practical stake in this conversation, raised a hand. Veloris acknowledged Mirren. Mirren said, "The procedural question before us is in fact quite narrow. It is this: was the declaration in error? If the answer is yes, the Council notes the error and proceeds from the corrected position. This does not constitute reinstatement. It does not require a security review or a capability assessment. It requires only a factual determination. The petitioner is right that we cannot conduct any subsequent process accurately while operating from a false factual baseline." The word accurate settled into the chamber the way a stone settles into still water. It makes no noise, but you watch the rings spread. Karen said, "The Velhari do not dispute the factual question. The Velhari are concerned about the precedent of revising a council record of this age without full verification of the circumstances described." I said, "With your permission, Administrator." Veloris nodded. I said, "First voice Karen, verification is available. We have brought a complete documentation set covering the entire period of the silence, 900 years of continuous human habitation records, engineering logs, medical records, census data, and historical archive. My colleague, engineer historian Tomás Reyes Okafor, is available to present that documentation to any review committee the Council designates, beginning today if the Council wishes. We are not asking you to take our word. We are asking for the opportunity to prove it. The record exists. We kept it. We kept it specifically for this purpose." Another silence. A longer one this time. Then Veloris set down the session marker, folded their hands on the podium, and looked at me for a long moment in a way that I had not been prepared for. It was not the look of an administrator managing a procedure. It was the look of an individual encountering something that has cut through the professional layer to something more personal underneath. Veloris said, "Ambassador, before we proceed to the formal vote, would you be willing to tell this chamber, without procedural framing, what your people have been doing?" I said, "Yes." I talked for 47 minutes. I did not read from prepared text. I talked from the center of myself, from the part that had been built by 19 years of education in a colony that had made the history of the silence the foundation of everything it taught, because a people who do not know what it cost to get here will not know how to protect it. I told them about Petra Novak. I told them about Grace Adeyemi and the paste and the atmospheric engineering that followed. I told them about the child who had never seen Earth and said the Real sky sounded beautiful. I told them about the quiet mandate, and what it meant to make survival not just a goal but a collective identity. I told them about the 300 people on Ship 7 who lost the argument and then spent the rest of their lives building the civilization they had voted to protect. I told them about Alicia Ford, who had never seen rain and wrote the most extraordinary music I have ever heard, based on descriptions and old recordings and the testimonies of people who missed a sky they could not show their grandchildren. I told them about the memorial stones, what they were and what they were not. I told them about the generation vote. The 51.3%. The 700 million people who voted the other way and were not wrong to do so. I told them about the 140 million who died in the first 11 hours. I did not let that part go quickly. I stayed with it for a moment, because it deserved a moment, because those people were the entire reason we were in a room talking about paperwork, and they had names, and the names were in the archive on the record, and they had not been concluded. They had been lost, which is a different thing, and the difference is important. When I was done, the chamber was quiet for a period of time that I did not count. Then Veloris called the vote. The question, as Mirren had correctly framed it, was narrow: was the declaration in error? 19 votes in favor of finding in the affirmative. 8 against. 4 abstentions. The Velhari abstained. Karen met my eyes when the result was read. They held my gaze for a moment and then looked down at the desk in front of them. I did not look away until they did. Veloris said, "The declaration is found to be in error. The record will be amended. The human union is recognized as a living civilization and invited to initiate formal reinstatement proceedings under standard council protocols. This session is adjourned." I walked back to Dock 7 Alpha. Owen was waiting at the end of the gangway. He handed me a cup of tea without saying anything. I drank it. We sat in the quiet of the dock for a while, with the sounds of the station moving around us and the consequence behind us, solid and patient, named for a reason. I said, "Send the message." He said, "Already written and queued." I said, "What does it say?" He said, 3 words. "We are recognized." I said, "Send it." He sent it. Across 11 systems, through the relay network that had been our only connection for 1,000 years, the message moved at the speed of everything we had built. 3 words. We are recognized. We are not what you buried. I am Sarah Mwangi Cole, and I am writing this from my desk at the reliquary, 6 months after the session, on a morning that looks exactly like every other morning in every visible detail, and is nothing like any morning that has ever come before it. Outside my porthole, a maintenance crew from the brown dwarf colony is working on the reliquary's outer hull, doing routine calibration of the external sensors that have, for the past 6 months, been seeing considerably more traffic than they were designed to manage. I can hear the crew through the insulation, their voices an indistinct and comfortable murmur, punctuated occasionally by a laugh. I do not know what they said. I hope it was something worth laughing at. This is the first entry of what we are calling the new human archive. It is different from the old archive, which is the reliquary's original purpose, a vault, a preservation system, a place for things that might be lost. The old archive was built from grief and necessity. It said, "We might not survive, so we will record everything we were." It was an act of love performed in terror. The new archive is something different. It is a record of things that are alive and continuing, not things preserved against the possibility of loss, and the distinction is more significant than it might initially appear. I have been thinking about the right word for what this new archive is. The closest I have come so far is witness. It is a record that witnesses what is happening, not what happened. It looks forward and sideways instead of only backward. Dara's message reached us 9 hours after she sent it, which is the transmission time from Council space to the reliquary at current relay speeds, though Tomas's engineering team has been working on improvements that should reduce that to 6 hours by the end of the year. 3 words, broadcast on the main relay frequency, "We are recognized." I was awake when it arrived. It was 4 in the morning by the reliquary's clock cycle, which is calibrated to the brown dwarf colony's schedule, which is calibrated to a 24-hour day because the humans who built the first colony were from Earth and could not quite make themselves let go of that rhythm even when there was no sun to justify it. I was awake because I had not been able to sleep, which is a thing that happens to me when I know something important is about to happen and cannot do anything to affect it. I read the message on the small screen in the communications room and then I sat there in the dark with it for a long time, long enough that my tea went cold and I did not notice until I tried to drink it. Then I went and made fresh tea and sat back down at my desk and started cataloging archive items, because that is what I do when the feelings are too large for the space I have available to hold them in, and that is what I did for the rest of that morning. The formal reinstatement process has been moving more quickly than I expected, though not as quickly as some of the more optimistic members of the return team had hoped. The capability review that First Voice Karen had insisted upon as a procedural requirement was completed in 3 months, which is approximately 1/4 of the typical timeline for such reviews. The reason it went so quickly was simple: we provided documentation that was comprehensive, organized, cross-referenced, independently verifiable, and so thorough that the reviewing teams had, by the end of the 2nd week, stopped looking for gaps and started looking for the most efficient way to process the volume of material being presented. Tomas spent 6 weeks in direct consultation with the review committee. By his own account, delivered in a message to me halfway through week 3, it was the most enjoyable professional experience of his life, which for a man who genuinely loves the material he works with is a meaningful statement. He said the committee members kept asking questions that went well beyond the scope of the review and into genuine intellectual curiosity, and that by the end of week 4 several of them had requested access to specific areas of the archive for personal research purposes. By the end of the capability review's first month, 2 committee members had formally requested access to the atmospheric processor schematics originally developed by Grace Adeyemi 400 years ago. By the end of the 2nd month, 11 had made similar requests for various elements of the Human Technical Archive. By the end of the 3rd month, the atmospheric processor documentation had been formally shared with 6 council species under licensing terms that Dara's team negotiated carefully and fairly, with appropriate provisions for attribution and for the compensation of the human union for the use of work that belongs to our people. And 3 of those 6 species had already returned preliminary data from their own atmospheric engineering programs, which our scientists described, in the deliberately understated language of people trying not to seem too eager, as extremely interesting and potentially quite significant. This is how it actually starts. Not with a grand declaration. Not with a moment in a chamber that becomes the subject of historical paintings. It starts with Grace Adeyemi's paste, made 400 years ago by a teenager who was too young to know what was supposed to be impossible, being shared across a conference table with beings who had never heard her name, and those beings taking it home and thinking about it and sending something back. The Velhari situation is genuinely complicated, and I want to be honest about that rather than smoothing it over with good news, because the new archive is supposed to witness what is actually happening, not the version that would make a more comfortable story. First voice Karen requested a bilateral meeting with Dara in the second month after the session. The meeting lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes. Dara gave me a summary that evening in a long and unusually candid message, and she described it as one of the most difficult conversations she had ever been part of, which means something coming from someone who has been in difficult conversations professionally for her entire career. Karen said, at a certain point in that meeting, the Velhari voted to sign the declaration because we believed the loss was complete. I need you to understand that there was no indifference in it. We held a formal mourning period. We commissioned a memorial. We taught it in our schools as one of the great tragedies in galactic history. Dara said, I believe all of that. Karen said, we did not move on. I have heard that characterization and it is not accurate. We did not simply continue as if nothing had happened. Dara said, I know. I believe you. And I want to say clearly, the human union is not approaching this moment as an accusation. We are not here to tell you what you should have done differently. We are here because we are alive and because we want to be part of this community again. What happened, happened. What comes next is what we are here to talk about. Karen was quiet for a moment that Dara described as quite long. Then they said, what do you want from us? Dara said, I want us to know each other. Properly. Without the assumption between us that we are finished, or that we are dangerous, or that the distance of 1,000 years means we have nothing to offer each other. I want the chance to find out what we actually are to each other. Karen said, and if what we find is difficult? Dara said, then we deal with it honestly. That is what we have been doing for 1,000 years. We are used to difficult. Karen considered this. And then they said something that Dara found surprising enough to quote directly in her message to me. Karen said, the thing I find most disorienting about this situation is not that you survived. It is that you came back. Every difficult scenario we prepared for, after the vote, involved the possibility that a surviving human group might make contact eventually, in various conditions. None of our scenarios involved a human civilization of 14 billion people coming back and being this calm about it. Dara said, we had time to decide how we wanted to do this. Karen said, you had time to be angry. Dara said, we did that too. We had 1,000 years. We had time for everything. In the weeks since that meeting, the Velhari diplomatic track has moved slowly but genuinely. Karen submitted a formal request for educational exchange, which is a Velhari diplomatic mechanism for beginning a long-term process of mutual understanding. It is not a fast mechanism. It is not designed to be. It is designed to be honest and gradual, which is, I think, exactly the right pace for what we are doing. For other species have requested some form of formal cultural exchange. 2 of them were among the 8 that voted against acknowledging the error in the Extinction Declaration. I mentioned this to Owen Briggs when he visited the reliquary last month, and he said it did not surprise him at all, and that voting against something in a formal session and then reaching out privately afterward was just what you did when you were uncertain, because the vote was about procedure and the reaching out was about the actual feeling underneath the procedure. I thought this was an unusually insightful observation from someone who described himself as primarily an engineer, and I told him so. He shrugged and said he had spent a lot of time listening during the transit and had found it instructive. I received a message 3 weeks ago from a young Velhari researcher named Second Voice Rs, who identified themselves as 22 years old by Velhari Reckoning, which are translation notes flagged as a young adult by most comparable standards. Rs had found a reference to the first Rain Symphony in the newly accessible Human Archive catalog and was writing to ask whether the piece was available for listening. I sent the full recording with a personal note. I explained who Alicia Ford was, and that she had never seen Rain, and what she had used as the basis for the composition. I explained the oral history tradition of the Silence era, the way knowledge of Earth had been passed from generation to generation in a chain of description, memory being described to people who could only imagine the thing being remembered, and their imaginations becoming the next generation's only source for that same knowledge. Ars wrote back 46 hours later. The message said, I listened to it 4 times. Then it said, I think I understand something now that I did not understand before, about what it means to carry something you have never directly experienced but still completely believe in. I am not sure I can say it more precisely than that. But I wanted to thank you for sending it. I read that message 3 times. Then I put my head down on my desk and stayed there for approximately 30 seconds, which is the closest I have come in 6 months to losing my composure entirely, and I do not regret it. Tomas came to the reliquary 4 weeks ago. He said the archive transfer needed to be completed in person because he needed to see the place where everything would be kept. I showed him the main hall first. It is the largest interior space in the asteroid, a chamber roughly 60 meters in length with climate-controlled vaults lining the walls from floor to ceiling, organized by era and category, containing the 17 million items that represent everything we chose to keep. It takes about 12 minutes to walk the full length of it at a normal pace. Tomas walked it without speaking. He stopped at the far end, in front of the section that holds the oral history recordings from the first generation. The actual voices, recorded on equipment that barely worked, of people who had walked on Earth and watched it burn and survived and then had to explain to their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren what had been lost. He put his hand flat against the case and held it there for a moment. He said, they would not believe this. Any single one of them. They would not believe this is where we ended up. I said, some of them would. The stubborn ones would. He laughed. A real laugh, the kind that takes something from you because it is genuine. Then he said, my daughter asked me what it felt like to watch the session. I had the feed running on the ship and she watched it with me, or most of it. She fell asleep near the end. I said, what did you tell her? He said, I told her it felt like finally breathing out after you have been holding your breath for a very long time. She said that sounded uncomfortable. I said, the holding your breath part is. But the breathing out is wonderful. I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The Council formally struck the extinction record 19 days ago. Veloris conducted the administrative session personally, which was not standard protocol for a record amendment and which I read as a deliberate choice to mark the moment without making it a performance. It was brief and simple. The clerk read the amendment into the official record. Species, Homo sapiens. Common designation, human. Home system, soul, with recognized additional systems. Status, active. Council standing, formal reinstatement proceedings ongoing. I watched the broadcast from my desk. The clerk's voice had the same flat administrative tone as the voice in the recording I have watched 642 times. The voice that said, motion carries. Next item. The voice that moved on to the water rights dispute. This voice said, record amended. And then it moved on to the next item. I found this perfect. The memorial stones are still standing. This question has come through diplomatic channels more than once in the past 6 months, always phrased carefully, always asking whether the human union has any plans to modify or remove them in light of improving relations. Dara's official responses have been diplomatic and thorough. Mine, in the personal communication I sent to the council liaison who asked me directly, was simpler. They said, do you intend to keep them? I said, yes. They said, even now that the situation is improving. I said, they are not monuments to a situation. They are monuments to a cost. They will stand as long as we do. Not to remind anyone outside us of anything. To remind us. The memorial stones are how we tell the next generation, and the one after that, and the one after that, what it cost. Not in abstract numbers. Not in the language of historical events that happened to other people. In stone, in public, in a place where children walk past it every day on their way to school. This is what happened. This is what people paid. You are here because of decisions made in the dark by people who were afraid and did it anyway. Do not let the cost become a fact you know without feeling. Keep feeling it. Keep knowing that you are here because something very nearly did not work out. We are keeping them. I visited the one in the brown dwarf colony the week before I took up my post at the reliquary permanently. I went in the early morning, when the corridors are quiet and the artificial dawn cycle has just begun and the light has the particular quality of something new. I stood in front of it for a long time without doing anything except looking at the names. There is no drama in looking at a wall. There is nothing to describe about it that is not simply the fact of a person and a wall in a quiet corridor at dawn. But I will tell you what I felt, because this is an archive and the archive should hold feelings as well as facts. I felt the weight of it. I felt it the way you feel a stone in your pocket, not painful, not debilitating, just present. Something that is there with every step. Something that has been there so long you have stopped noticing it separately from yourself. Then I felt something else. The breathing out thing that Tomas described. Because the wall is still there, and the names are still there, and we are still here to read them, and that combination, those three things together in the same moment, is something the people who signed the declaration did not think would ever be possible. They were wrong. Before I left that morning, I put my hand on the wall the way Tomas had put his hand on the archive case. Just for a moment. Then I walked back to my quarters, finished packing, and came here. This morning, at my desk, with the maintenance crew murmuring outside and the star called Endurance holding its light steady through the porthole, I opened the first page of the new human archive. I want to tell you what I wrote, because it is the beginning of the record and the beginning should be honest. I wrote this. We did not survive because we were exceptional. We survived because ordinary people, afraid and exhausted and uncertain, chose to keep going. They made that choice over and over, in conditions that gave them very little reason to believe it would matter. They made it in converted cargo bays and community meetings and long quiet corridors in the middle of the night. They made it for their children and their children's children and for people they would never meet and a future they could not clearly see. This archive is the record of that choice. Read it the way it was lived, imperfectly, at great cost, with no guarantee that it would come to anything. It came to something. It came to 14 billion people across 11 systems and a fleet that walked back into the Galactic Council and corrected a piece of paperwork that was wrong. We are still here. We are still here. I set down the stylus. Outside the porthole, the star called Endurance was doing what it has always done. Burning steady. Indifferent to us and our records and our archive and our arguments and our grief. Keeping light the way stars do, not for anyone specifically, just because that is what they are. We named it anyway. We sat in a room with bad lighting and lukewarm drinks and argued about it and named it. We named it because naming things is how you claim them, not as property but as part of your understanding. We look at a star and we say, that one matters. That one has a name. That one we are keeping. We named it Endurance, and it is ours, and it does not appear in any council registry, and we named it anyway. The other one is called What Next? We named that one too. That is the most human thing I know. Not the surviving, though the surviving matters enormously. Not the building, though the building was extraordinary. But the naming. The insistence that the things around us are not just background, not just scenery, not just the context in which we happen to be placed. The refusal to move through a universe without touching it, claiming it, putting our hands on it and saying, this one. This one has a name. This one we are keeping. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. On a Tuesday. Between two other items on a list. We named a star What Next, and we kept going, and here we are. Here we are.